Hello, it's been a minute, but that's because I just finished reading this big boy, War and Peace by Leo Tolstoy, and I anticipate this is going to be a bit of a difficult one to really talk about. First off, because I can't pretend to really have understood everything in a quick first reading of this book. This is definitely a novel that merits and asks of its reader multiple rereadings. And secondly, there's already so much good critical thought already given to this book by so many people. And so it really feels like I'm adding to an already overstuffed conversation, and I don't really want to add to the noise. Granted, this is more meant for myself just as kind of quick initial thoughts of readings anyways, and it's not really meant to be deep, thoughtful discourse, and instead just really meant to be more just kind of off-the-cuff initial impressions. So we're not trying to do that anyway, so it's not a big deal. But there's a few misconceptions that I would like to talk about, or at least common misconceptions that I feel like I have encountered when talking to other people who have read this book or wanted to read this book. First of all, this book is not that complicated. The tough part of this book is kind of the initial first book or the first volume even, and that's because you're just getting bombarded with a lot of characters. Some of them matter and reoccur and some of them don't, and it's tough as a reader to try and hold all of that in your head at once. Try to triage what characters you need to pay attention to, which characters you can just discard, etc. A simple character guide probably will help you a lot with this and make that task quite a bit easier. I really don't think it's that much more difficult than some bigger fantasy novels, which kind of expect you to be plunged into a brand new world and be introduced to a bunch of new characters. So that's kind of the first misconception I'd say, is if you're really wanting to read this book, don't be intimidated by it being difficult. It will be a little bit of a learning curve at first, but I think you'll find that this book is not nearly as difficult as people sometimes make it out to be. Secondly, this book isn't stuffy. It's not a slow crawl of boringness. More on that later, but what I want to make as the point here is this book was serialized similar to Anna Karenina, and I believe some of Dostoevsky's novels too, where they were released in parts in a literary magazine in Russia. And because of that, it seems to me that the authors really purposefully sped up the action into almost episodic content. And so instead of reading what feels like a novel that kind of starts at point A and takes as much time as it wants to meander to the end, it feels like Tolstoy really understood that he had to keep his audience coming back time and time again, almost like a TV show would. And so I don't think you're going to find this book to be boring. Granted, for myself, some of the war sections got really dull for me, and I do think that was kind of an individualized experience, because I would imagine if someone who has an interest in Napoleon or just war history in general would find those sections pretty interesting. I just personally don't find that at all interesting, and so the war bits of War and Peace really kind of drug on, especially near the end, where I was kind of just hoping and wishing for them to be gone. One of my initial impressions of this book is and I feel almost kind of silly saying it, but it's just so much worse than Anna Karenina. So I guess what I'm saying is, if you're really trying to decide between War and Peace or Anna Karenina as the big Russian novel you're going to spend your time investing in, I would highly, highly recommend reading Anna Karenina first. Not that War and Peace isn't some sort of classic masterpiece. I really believe that it was. I just think Anna Karenina is a lot better. So if you have to choose between the two, I would really nudge you to try and spend your time with Anna Karenina. I think you're going to really like that more. Unless, of course, you're just super into war history, then you'll probably love War and Peace a little bit more. The characters in this book almost felt less human than they did in Anna Karenina. Everybody in Anna Karenina felt very human and had human motivations and emotions, and some of the characters here just felt more caricaturish. If that's even a word, I'm not entirely sure, but they just felt kind of a little flatter, a little more idealistic. And Tolstoy wrote War and Peace when he was younger, and so maybe this is just what his understanding of human motivation was a little bit more shallow just based on his own experience up to that point. It's hard for me really so much later to really judge it, but I do think the characters are a lot more mature and fleshed out and interesting in Anna Karenina, whereas they kind of almost just stand for ideals in War and Peace and don't necessarily have very human motivations. There's also some misogyny in War and Peace, and I don't really want to delve too deep in that discussion because I feel ill-equipped to really talk about kind of that careful balance that we have to take of reading classics with modernist eyes, or not even modernist, but contemporary eyes, with today's morals and culture, and trying to wade through what the morals and cultures of a previous time were. But just know that that's there, and if you're particularly sensitive about it, it might bother you, it might not. But again, unfortunately, with a lot of classics, that's going to be really hard to avoid, especially the further back you go, the worse that's unfortunately going to get. And so if you're interested in the classics, that's just something that you'll probably have to equip yourself to deal with in whatever way you find best. I know this is a bit of a shorter video, but I think I'm going to stop it there. I feel like I don't have quite as much to say about this book, partly because it's so long and it said so much itself, and partly because I kind of had mixed feelings while reading it, and I don't want to just, as like my first impressions, flippantly dismiss something that I think really should probably be heralded as a masterpiece of literature. And so right now, kind of my first impressions are a bit lukewarm. I got a bit bored during the war parts. I found the characterizations to be a bit over the top. It kind of celebrated toxic masculinity in a weird sort of way that I didn't really appreciate. And some of that might just be me reading with modern eyes, but I don't remember feeling that way while reading Anna Karenina. At some point, I'll probably reread War and Peace again in my lifetime, maybe not for a while. And I'm guessing I'll probably get a lot more out of it then, and probably my issues with it will lessen. And so I don't really want to just be dismissive of it. But really, I'm glad I read it, but I didn't love it. There was parts of the book that I loved, but as a whole, it wasn't something that I necessarily really loved. So that's my thoughts on War and Peace, I guess.